Why Sam Harris Matters. I was invited to write the foreword to a new book, Sam Harris, Critical Responses, a collection of essays by various thinkers on the body of Sam Harris's work. It's edited by Professor Sandra Woyen of Arizona State University and published by Open Universe Books. I was happy to accept the invitation. My foreword is in print form in that now published volume, but I also wanted to make my thoughts on Sam Harris's work available in this podcast form. Sam Harris has carved out, I think justifiably, a place in the first rank of our public intellectuals. Now, he's most well known for his loose association with Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Richard Dawkins to mount a powerful critique against contemporary manifestations of religion. The New Atheists, as this group is colloquially called, took on repackaged, in some cases evolved forms of religious belief, and the New Atheists argued that they were false, immoral, and out of place in modern scientific and progressive reality. Yet Harris's real significance, I think, is broader than that important but narrow front in the culture wars. His body of work covers core issues in morality, free will, the nature of consciousness, religious history, psychedelics, artificial intelligences, and the implications of all of those for social theory and politics. He is a comprehensive thinker. But comprehensive thinkers were largely out of fashion during the 20th century for deeply philosophical reasons. The idea of making an intellectual system, or even of crossing major disciplinary boundaries, or for specialist thinkers of forthrightly applying one's narrow technical knowledge and methods to broader issues. That idea, or all of those formulations of ideas, were largely dismissed as outmoded and or pretentious. So the state of affairs was such that by the middle part of the 20th century, C.P. Snow's famous Two Cultures thesis took the world by storm. C.P. Snow was a chemist, research chemist, and a novelist, a rather rare combination. And his Two Cultures publication was first delivered as a lecture at Cambridge University in England in 1959. And what Snow argued was that intellectual culture was dysfunctionally split into two opposing camps, roughly the scientists in one camp and the art and literature types in the other opposite camp. Scientists studied the natural world, they prized rigor, and they were optimistically progressive in their outlook. But by contrast, the art and literature types, they explored messy people. They espoused non-rational and even irrational practices, and they were cynically pessimistic. So the turf, the human turf, the intellectual turf, the turf of trying to wrap our minds around and engage with the world, was divided into these two opposing domains, and each had its own methods and its own conclusions, and they were both disdainful and sarcastically so with respect to the others. You scientists, the artsy types would say accusingly, you are merely white-coated drones and you feel safe in your laboratories, but apparently you've never read a poem or had wild sex. Why don't you try living for a change? And then, of course, the advocates for science would retort, returning the favor, oh, you artists, you're just mostly unwashed barbarians, bohemians. You're on drugs half the time. You're just throwing paint at a canvas, trying to screw anything that moves. Why don't you try growing up? Now, more seriously, though, Snow's diagnosis of the two cultures did point to a deep problem for intellectual life. Each of these subcultures had evolved away from the other to the point that, say, a scientist could think of himself, or increasingly herself, as a highly educated person, even though he or she had no knowledge of Goethe, Dostoevsky, the French Revolution, post-impressionism, and so on and so on. Or a humanist, right, could be considered, worthy of a PhD degree without having, the smallest insight into genetics, calculus, and thermodynamics. And it wasn't just that reality is complex and intellectuals need to have specialties, there's a division of labor and so forth. It was that each side of the divide thought that the gulf was in principle unbridgeable. It was a complete hard either or, and that the other side was irrelevant to grasping the truly significant issues. So both sides were saying it's impossible if you're a scientific-minded person to integrate that with an arts and humanities understanding of the world. And the arts and humanities people are saying if you are approaching the world this way, that is unbridgeable. You can't get to a scientific, rational understanding. And both sides then want to say, we are the ones who are where the real action is and should be. The other side is irrelevant. Forget them. Now, if we fast forward then to the end of the 20th century, when young Sam Harris is traveling the world and then he's returning to university to finish his formal education. By then, this is now 30, 40 years after Snow's two-culture analysis, much of the arts and the humanities had descended further into vacuous postmodernism, various nihilisms, and at the same time, the sciences had continued their impressive progress. But there was a widespread recognition that there's a vacuum here that needs to be fulfilled. The two cultures dynamic had stalled. The two camps are not talking to each other anymore, and the impasse was unimpressive to a now new generation of thinkers with more comprehensive ambition and, in many cases, a willingness to make a fresh start. So this new generation began forming what science journalist John Brockman called the third culture. And this is a very interesting then phenomenon that we start to see coming together at the end of the 20th century and on into the 21st century. And this emerging view is that humanistic questions need scientific insight in order to be understood and resolved more fully, and that science is itself a deeply humanistic enterprise. It's by and for passionate and fully engaged human beings. So we need to get past this split and this two cultures impasse, some sort of integration. Now, this is not an entirely new phenomenon, for this is a 21st century reinvigoration of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment conception of the arts and the sciences as integrated. So if we think of the universal ambition and the integrated scope of Leonardo da Vinci's projects, he's an engineer, he's a speculative scientist, he's an inventor, he's also an amazing artist and a humanist. Or if we think of Michelangelo's humanistic ideal artworks, but they're made possible in significant part only by his detailed scientific anatomical studies. Or if we think back to Francis Bacon with his theme of knowledge is power, the idea here is that we want scientific power, scientific insight, and what that power to unveil all of nature's secrets is going to then enable us to apply them to the full range of human values and human aspirations. So that integration is an old phenomenon, but it was lost and perhaps destroyed for much of the 20th century. So, who's, though, best positioned to build the bridge, right? To cross it and to fill the vacuum that was left by the two cultures? And it seems that as it's the scientists who actually have the most real-world focus and a proven track record of actually solving problems and improving the human condition. Maybe we should expect that it's going to be scientifically trained thinkers who disproportionately are going to make up the third culture. And then we get the trend that was inaugurated in the late 20th century by science-rooted intellectuals such as Stephen Jay Gould, E.O. Wilson, Carl Sagan, Douglas Hofstadter, all of them who are coming from scientific backgrounds primarily, but they are forthrightly applying their insights and methods beyond their disciplinary confines. Now, this takes us to Sam Harris. Sam Harris's scholarly base is in the biological sciences. He's got a PhD in neuroscience. Now, this is combined with his undergraduate degree in philosophy, and then as a young man, his travels to the Far East to try to experience firsthand its traditions of religion. And so that positions him as a rather unique individual with the knowledge set and the skill set with which, and he's got, of course, a considerable dose of chutzpah to launch his now comprehensive intellectual project.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claim that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks's concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
My point here in this episode is not whether Harris's particular positions on the big issues is correct. That's not the key point. His significance is in his project of explaining, or explaining away sometimes, the whole shebang by applying the best of science and scientific method to those humanistic questions. And that is the future-oriented commitment that's relevant to all genuine intellectuals. We do need to go into our silos, but we also need to step outside of our silos and make connections to people in other silos, integrate their material, apply it to the real world. We want the whole shebang. Now, Harris's views are, of course, very reductionistic, arguing that in a material universe, rather, there's not any room for an autonomous consciousness, for free will, for morality, at least not if we traditionally understand them. So he tends to explain them as illusions, and or he tends to explain them away as unreal or as mere kind of subjective intuitions that may or may not be widespread in the human population. So he does have this very deep premise that we can have real facts about the world, or we can have genuine values. But since we can't have both, he believes, Harris opts for the real facts. Now, in this connection, I want to say a few words here about Jordan B. Peterson, another contemporary intellectual, first-rate public intellectual, and a synthesizer, and one who is aware, painfully aware, of the C.P. Snow two cultures problems, and who accepts that there is, in our intellectual life, this huge gulf between our scientific and our value understandings of the world. Now, as a sidebar, I also have a podcast and an article on Dr. Peterson's Peterson's efforts to overcome the divide, though his recent thinking seems to see it as an unsolved or perhaps unsolvable problem. But if we have to choose between a scientific fact orientation and a genuine values orientation, Peterson is moving in the direction of prioritizing a more mythic religious worldview that supports values first and foremost. So I do think that the recorded meetings, there have been several of them, between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson are instructive about the state of our intellectual culture, carrying on this deep 20th century divide that was diagnosed by C.P. Snow, the scientists versus the humanists, but our contemporary first-rate public intellectuals engaging with it at a high level. I recently came across this post on social media by Tyler Ashby Scott, who provided a very nice and concise digest, I thought. These are in Tyler Scott's words of the various Harris-Peterson exchanges. And I think this is a good summary of where those two very smart individuals are. So here's Peterson, quote, "I hear when you say that religions have a history of being violent, and I agree that rationality is important, but religion communicates deep truths about values that can only be understood through profound narrative. If you dispose of religion, you dispose of the foundation on which our values rest." And then Harris responds, "The values illustrated in the Bible can be discovered and understood by secular and rational means." And then Peterson replies, "Well, I want that to be true, but there's two problems with that. You can't explain how we derived values from facts. And there isn't an intermediary framework biology between your mind and truth that influences what you judge as moral valuable. That makes those judgments non-objective and not entirely rational." And then Harris responds, "Well, all of us recognize certain truths about what's good and evil, and all of us know that if good is to mean anything, it must include the elimination of unnecessary suffering." And then Peterson replies, "Well, your intuitions are insufficient. They don't provide a sustainable basis for values in the way religion does." And then Harrison replies, "But religion produces dogma and barbarism." And then, as Tyler Ashby Scott notes wryly, we return to the beginning of the conversation and cycle through the discussion again and again. So this highlights, I think, the key issue in this gulf between the two cultures, the more scientific orientation and the humanistic value orientation, the fact and value connection issue. Philosophy has, from its near beginnings, been plagued by various dualisms that to this day seem to force us into unsatisfying either-ors. One of those dualisms traditionally has been a metaphysical dualism endorsed by most traditional religions, that there's this moral, higher spiritual reality and this amoral or immoral, lower physical reality. That sets us up for an unbridgeable gulf. There also is in philosophy a reason versus emotion dualism that's been prominent. We conceive of reason as this cold and value-free logic machine, and we contrast that to this passionate and value-oriented but often irrational feelings that we have. And that sets us up for an unbridgeable gulf. There are various linguistic dualisms, such as Hume's famous is-ought distinction, where we have semantic formulations that describe versus semantic formulations that prescribe, and we make a hard brick wall between the two of them. Now, in my view, all of those dualisms are false alternatives, but we need to get into the deep philosophy to see why. But I do think that overcoming them is and should be a central concern of contemporary philosophy.
You are listening to Open College with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Follow Open College on X, Facebook, and on Substack at opencollegepodcast.substack.com. You can also follow Dr. Stephen Hicks on X at SRC Hicks and Open College Pod. Please leave a review in your podcast player and like, share, and subscribe to Open College.